Thank you. Hello, I'm Rick Steele, and I serve as the chair of the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic media. Jonna Norton.
Here.
Bruce Nystrom.
Here.
Abby Callis.
I'm here.
Okay. Carol Crane.
Here.
Jessica Hamilton.
Here.
Tiffany Johnson.
Here.
Janine Kesterson.
Here.
Rodney McNeil.
Here.
Zachary Parrott.
Here.
And Doug Wright.
Here.
I note the following staff members are also present: David Fye
Here.
and Leslie Allen.
Here.
Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting that is being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns. But the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at the meeting today, as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this meeting, public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and by watching the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, are not suspended. Therefore, we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On December 17th, 2021, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of the advisory committee meetings. This notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at the website. An agenda and other meeting materials will be posted to the board's website on the day of the meeting, and those were posted. And you are also able to request a copy of the agenda by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line "Request for the agenda," and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may contact the board office, and since we are after hours at the moment, we would recommend that you send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using a link to the meeting on the agenda. And Rick, you are muted.
That would help. The meeting is now called to order, and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first item on its agenda, which is the approval of the agenda. I believe all of you received a copy of that in the last day or so. If you've had a chance to look at that, and unless there's any additions, I would entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
Rick, I move we approve the agenda.
I
Was that
second
Doug?
the approval.
Okay, Doug moved and Jessica seconded it. Let's all in favor of approval of the agenda, please signify.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the motion carries. Our second item is approval of the minutes from our previous meeting. And I believe you all received that as well. Those are the minutes from, I believe, the October 12th meeting, which seems like somewhat of a lifetime ago. You've had a chance to any comments or questions about those minutes? Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll put a motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Jessica. Is there a
I'll
second?
second. I'll second.
Thank you, Abby. All in favor of approving the minutes, please signify.
Aye.
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 Any
Aye.
All right, so we are down to agenda item number 4, which is the executive director's report. So I'll turn that over to David Fye.
Thank you, Rick. I put together a list of items to inform the advisory committee about, and I'll start with some agency updates. So as of January 4th, 2022, the governor directed most state employees to return to working primarily in state offices. Prior to that, there was a directive by the governor to have most members working remotely. But as of January 4th, most members of the office have returned to the office and are working here. We were authorized to begin a telework pilot in the fall of 2021 prior to having most staff members return to their remote work. So we have gone back to our telework pilot, and that we'll be doing that this spring, and then we'll be looking at it in June to go ahead and collect information and see if that should be revised. But our licensing employees are working here in the office, and our 2 investigators are in the office 3 days, but they're doing the telework under the policy 2 days each week. Last Wednesday, the office was closed as most state agencies' offices were closed due to winter weather. However, state employees were asked to work remotely if they were able. So most of our employees were able to do some work remotely. So I just want to call attention to that because I really appreciate their efforts. I feel bad that we couldn't give them a traditional snow day, but I think we're working under new circumstances now. But I appreciate all the work that they do, especially working on a day when some of the offices were closed. And then the last item under agency updates I wanted to let you know is we had previously had an open position for an administrative assistant, and I'm proud to say that we were able to select a candidate who accepted the position. Her name is Tyla Wadsworth, and she has been working for the BSRB for about the last month, and we're really excited to have her in the office. She's been picking up a lot of things around the office, and she'll be a big asset to the agency. Next, I'm going to provide some updates on board activity. So the board had its annual planning meetings. Usually that is a 1-day event, sometimes 2 in September. Because of the direction of the governor's office not to hold in-person meetings and the fact that all of our meetings right now are being done over Zoom, the board elected to have that spread over 2 days, one at the end of September and one at the end of October. There were a number of changes that occurred through the course of the board's work at those meetings, and a lot of those were confirmed or clarified at the board's meeting in January. So I'll touch on a few of those items. First, there was previously a board governance document, which was an item, it was a policy that the board had elected to adopt several years ago. And that board governance policy was last modified in 2011. And so over the course of the years, some of the work of the board and some of the different ways in which the board operates has changed. There were some internal inconsistencies with a few of the provisions, and there were a number of the items that the board really needed to review and decide if they wanted to continue or make changes. So the board did a lot of work examining that document and working through some of the changes. The end result at the January meeting was production of 2 different documents. One was an expectations of board members document, which we'll be talking about a little bit later in the training today. And the second was an advisory committee policy, which both elements of both were included in the previous document, but they've been changed a significant amount of ways, and you'll be seeing both of those during the training. Additionally, there was introduction of a third document at the January meeting. So as we have been broadcasting meetings, we've been having more individuals aware of the work of the board and of the advisory committees, and that has led to some additional questions which the board office receives, and some additional individuals who have sat in on meetings or have viewed the meetings. And we thought it would be necessary to go ahead and create a document, a guidance document for public attendees of meetings. And so that'll be touched upon in the training, but we think that's a really helpful thing for the public. Those 3 documents I mentioned, the expectations of board members, advisory committee policy, and also the guidance for public attendees at meetings are all posted on the board's website after they were approved in January. So they're available for anyone to look at and examine and ask us questions about. Another item I wanted to provide an update at that we got clarification from the board and legal counsel at the January board meeting is there was a bill that was passed by the 2021 legislature. It was House Bill 2066. And part of the provisions in that bill included expedited licensure for military members, military spouses. There were different requirements for individuals who were in state and those that were intending to reside in the state of Kansas. They also provided another way of reciprocity for individuals to seek licensure in Kansas And it lowered the number of years of practice under those provisions to 1 year of practice. Well, currently, the board does have the ability to issue provisional licenses in certain circumstances. And generally, those happen when someone is within about 1 year of fulfilling the requirements of licensure, either because they are short of a class or there's some minor thing that they can accomplish within the course of that year. So the board, or the agency, sought clarification from the board and legal counsel how to interpret House Bill 2066 and the provisional license requirements in combination, and just needed some clarification how to examine those requirements in terms of applicants. And so legal counsel for the board did clarify that those really should be separate paths for licensure. And so individuals may apply for licensure under these new provisions in 2066, or they may seek a provisional license under those requirements, but they should not be used in combination. There are different paths individuals could pursue for licensure. Additionally, there was an update on syncing expiration date for multiple licenses. There are over 1,000 individuals who have a license under the BSRB who also have a second or sometimes third license. And we had received some requests from individuals to change the expiration date for all their licenses so they would come due at the same time. Each of the advisory committees had discussed that as an option for licensees and reported back to the board. The general consensus was that for individuals who would want to pursue that, the board would like to have a method for individuals to elect to do that, but it should be voluntary and it shouldn't be something required for all licensees, because there was some concern that individuals may not want to have all of the fees come due at the same time, or may have different CE requirements based on their different professions, and they may want to spread them out so that they can keep track of those better and not have all of those due at the same time. So the agency will be looking and comparing statutes from other states to see a clean method of looking at that over the course of the year. To change that, it will require legislation. So over the course of this current year, we'll be looking at some language to propose to the board to look to see if we can put something into a bill for consideration of next year's legislature to give licensees that option. And then the last update from that board meeting is the board had been discussing, and a lot of the advisory committees had been discussing, how to handle records of deceased practitioners or abandoned records from practitioners. There's a statute for the Board of Healing Arts, but they are a much larger agency and they have a specific fund to assist them in dealing with how to handle those records. The BSRB sees those types of situations about 1 or 2 times per year, but the advisory committees had all had the opportunity to weigh in, and they recognized that there was an issue there. We were hoping to work with the Office of the Attorney General and the Consumer Protection Division concerning a method for how to assist that office and in terms of identifying a next person to take possession of those records. Our initial understanding of when they would seize records was a little different in working through the mechanics, and then also in thinking through how to put this into either maybe regulation. There were some questions about the practical sense of how would someone establish a new custodian. And so what we are going to be doing this year is really trying to work through the mechanics of that, and then we'll bring back a proposal to the board, because there was a general consensus that this is something that the board wants to resolve or have something in place to deal with this issue. But we would not want to put something in place in regulation or statute without knowing how we can advise practitioners and how they should pursue this and what's required of them because of this new responsibility. So we are going to be working on that, but I wanted to make you aware of those conversations. Next, there are some legislative updates that I wanted to make you aware of. We are in the middle of the 2022 legislative session. That session began on January 10th, 2022. Legislation was requested by the agency on behalf of the board of the BSRB. That is Senate Bill 387. And Senate Bill 387 includes recommendations from the board of the BSRB. 3 items are specifically included in that legislation. The first is an item affecting social work, and that is to add back some language that was struck from the statute in dealing with individuals seeking clinical licensure as a social worker. There was language that as a requirement of a clinical practicum, individuals would receive 350 hours of direct client contact. That was struck. There was an amendment put on the bill last year that struck that. However, the amendment went further and struck language or additional postgraduate supervised experience as determined by the board. And the problem with that is that legal counsel for the board has informed us that with that language removed from statute, the board is no longer able to evaluate individuals with a different type of practicum, such as an administrative practicum. Previously, the board was able to check to see if those individuals met all the requirements, but without that language in there, applicants now must have had a clinical practicum or else they don't have another option. So it is somewhat limiting, and we don't believe that was the intent of the amendment. So we have asked the legislature to add that language back in. The second item involves the addiction counseling profession. Currently in statute, for most professions, if you are a licensee under the BSRB at a master's level or higher, you are able to use that standing to take the examination to become a master's level addiction counselor. However, we have received some requests from individuals that have had difficulty with that examination and would like the option to test for the lower level addiction counselor license. But currently, we do not have the flexibility to offer that in statute. The only thing we're able to offer is the ability to test for the master's level addiction counselor license. So we have, the board recommended including language to allow that flexibility, and we are pursuing that in Senate Bill 387. And then the last item is the recommendation that the board had in terms of requiring 3 hours of continuing education for the licensed psychology profession in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have information in the bill noting that within the existing hours of continuing education required for licensed psychologists every 2 years, they currently must receive 3 hours in ethics and 6 hours in diagnosis and treatment. And under this new requirement, they will be able to essentially fulfill the requirements of this new requirement if they had ethics hours that included the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or if they had 3 hours in diversity, equity, and inclusion that also involved the diagnosis and treatment requirement. So within the 50 hours, it's either 3 hours that are required in this area, or you can fulfill it by satisfying one of the existing requirements that also involves the diversity, equity, and inclusion requirement. The hearing for Senate Bill 387 is going to be in the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee, and that is tomorrow morning at 8:30. The committee will be broadcast on the legislative YouTube channel, and so I'll be providing testimony on behalf of the agency and speaking with the committee at that time. Another legislative update I want to make you aware of is that each year, all agencies' budgets have to be approved by both the House budget committees and also the Senate subcommittees. Currently, those Senate budgets have been going to actual standing committees. We have already gone through the House process. We were heard by the House Higher Education Budget Committee. They asked lots of questions, but passed out the budget as we had submitted it. It was reported out favorably by the chair of that committee in House Appropriations on Monday morning. And then the Senate budget hearing is scheduled for tomorrow at 9:30 in the Senate Transparency and Ethics Committee. So tomorrow morning, I'll be going to the bill hearing at 8:30 and then the budget hearing at 9:30. But that will be in the Senate Transportation and Ethics Committee at 9:30. And then we are scheduled to have that budget reported out of Senate Ways and Means Committee on Friday at 10:30. And then I've been monitoring other bills related to the BSRB. There have not been a number of mental health bills that have been requested this year, but I'm continuing to track those, and I will inform the board if any of those are scheduled for hearings that the board may want to weigh in on and offer testimony or a position on those bills. In terms of one other update I wanted to make you aware of, recently I was asked to present information at a conference of the Federation of Associations of Regulatory Boards on the topic of public protection through creative access to information. And I went ahead and accepted that invitation, and I went to Fort Worth, Texas, and presented information on that topic in regards to what the board and the advisory committees of the board have been working on. I was happy to share information about the efforts of the agency to put out additional information on the agency's website. I spoke in detail about the agency's YouTube channel, and then our efforts to answer questions from individuals. And I was asked a lot of questions from different states and different agencies after that point. I also had an opportunity to hear information on different topics that other states are dealing with. And had a chance to talk to some individuals from different regulatory boards in other states about their operational processes, which to me is very valuable because I'm still in the process of evaluating a lot of our internal processes. And, my time is limited in terms of what all I can look at from different states, but having a short conversation with individuals here and there, it really helps me kind of understand better what other states are doing. And then it's items that I can consider or bring back to the board as possible changes. And so that was a really good event. And it learned a lot from that and had a good experience presenting that information. So with that, I'll go ahead and end my report, and I'd be happy to answer any questions on those topics.
Thank you, David. I have one question. So during the testimony tomorrow for 387, I think at maybe the last board meeting, one of the questions was how exactly should we define diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I had forwarded some definitions provided by APA as well as by the Commission on Accreditation. Will those be sufficient, or do you need more information that in case that question comes up? I can imagine that question coming from some of the legislators.
Yeah, so from a practical sense, the board approved the framework of requiring the 3 hours in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and allowing those hours to fulfill the requirements if they, were met by both the ethics and diagnosis and treatment. In terms of a full definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion, so I appreciate you forwarding that information to me, and I think it is helpful. I definitely reviewed it. I think that's something that will probably need to be established in rules and regulations to clarify in detail. Usually the statute kind of sets the framework, and then the rules and regulations will kind of elaborate or more clearly indicate what's required in that area. And so, I was prepared to reference that. And I think, if the committee did ask me about implementation, I think if the bill is enacted in the statute, the next step would be to pursue a definition under rules and regulations for that. And then once that was through, then I think what we would be looking at is the first time that the new requirement would be enforced by the BSRB. We'll probably be looking at June of 2024. So that's kind of the time frame in mind, but I do appreciate you forwarding that information, and I do anticipate a question on that issue. I think it just may be more appropriate for rules and regulations instead of the statute.
Other questions for David? Okay, well then it looks like we may be down to old business, and that would include an update on the SciPAC Commission.
Yes, and I can speak on this topic. So as you recall, last year there was a bill that was passed that added Kansas to SciPAC, the Multistate Compact for professional counselors, that in large part would allow licensed psychologists in compact states the ability to apply to the SciPAC Commission for authority to practice telehealth services. There's also an option to apply to the SciPAC Commission to be able to practice a limited number of days in compact states during the course of a year. So the bill indicated that Kansas would become an active member of SciPAC. The implementation date was January 1st, 2022. So as of January 1st, 2022, licensed psychologists were able to apply to SciPAC Commission to practice under the terms of the Multistate Compact. We did include information on the board's website with links for individuals who are interested in practicing under SciPAC. As of the end of January, I reached out to the SciPAC Commission just for an update on Kansas practitioners. They indicated to me that as of January 31st, there were 19 individuals who had applied to do teletherapy under the SciPAC Commission and had been granted authority to do so. And then there was one individual who had applied to do the temporary practice in compact states in person, and they had been approved to do so. And so they indicated that they've had 0 denials so far based on the applicants that have applied. There are requirements that are specified under the SciPAC Commission in terms of who can apply and who's eligible for consideration. And there's links to that on the BSRB website as well. I went ahead and in your materials for this meeting included the most recent SciPAC Commission newsletter. That was from December of 2021. Just wanted to highlight a few items in that newsletter. So on page 2, it notes that there was the annual SciPAC Commission meeting on November 18th, 2021. I did attend that meeting virtually. The action taken at that meeting was largely procedural. However, one of the items the commission does is reviews if there's any possible conflicts with states that have passed legislation to just see if the legislation would be a reason that they wouldn't be able to practice in the compact for one reason or another. They were able to review Arkansas and West Virginia and determined that they were eligible to be included in the compact, and so they voted to accept those two. There is a mid-year meeting planned for this year in July of 2022, and the annual meeting for this year will be in November of 2022. In terms of items from page 3, there are currently 26 states that participate in Kansas, and there's a list of those states below. It also notes that we became a part of SciPAC on January 1st of 2022. And then the remainder of the document includes some SciPAC totals per state. I'll just highlight the top 5 states that have the most members under SciPAC. Number 1 is Pennsylvania with 575 that have the teletherapy ability to practice. Texas second at 574. Illinois third at 511. Maryland fourth at 440. And then Virginia fifth at 409. And the state with the most individuals to practice in person for a limited number of days is Texas, and they have 33 who have applied for that. SciPAC also tracks the uptake on individuals applying for the SciPAC Commission by quarter, and so that is included on the last 3 pages of the document. So the SciPAC practitioners are growing, and as more states join the compact, that's expected to continue to grow. In terms of the BSRB, there is a link on the BSRB website where if you, it's a way for members of the public to verify if someone claims to be practicing under the compact from a different state. They can check the link to see if that person is practicing under SciPAC. So it's also a way for us, should we receive complaints about practitioners who are practicing under SciPAC, we can use their database to verify if those people are registered under the SciPAC Commission. So we will continue to track this. I'll provide updates as we go along and let you know if Kansas practitioners continue to seek to practice under the compact. As we talked about before, there is a $10 assessment per individual who identifies Kansas as their home state, but it's a look back approach. So the first time that we would see that assessed on the state of Kansas and the BSRB would be in January of 2023, looking back at calendar year 22. At the annual meeting every year, there is also a vote to determine if that assessment should continue. So I will keep you informed about that as well. The board and the advisory committee did weigh in, and there was authority granted in the bill to allow the board to charge a fee for individuals who practice under the SciPAC Commission who identify Kansas as their home state of $25, primarily as a way to recoup the cost of that assessment that'll be charged by the SciPAC Commission on the state of Kansas, because it is $10 per year. And there is some work with the BSRB and working with the SciPAC Commission. So we are still going through the rules and regs process on a number of different changes, and that's one item we're still working on as well. So I'll pause and see if you have any questions on SciPAC.
I have one little question. I suppose it's a question. Now that we're live, and I think it relates to the $25 fee, is there a way for the CRC, Complaint Review Committee, to flag any complaints that are specifically related to SciPAC practitioners, just as a way of kind of assessing is this costing more money than it's, are we breaking even? That's the goal, right? Because we're a state agency, but is there a way to flag those in some way? And that just reflects ignorance on my part.
So I can talk to our investigators and then ask them. One thing they do is when they receive a complaint against a practitioner, part of the process is verifying that we actually have jurisdiction over that person. And so prior to SciPAC becoming effective, we would be looking at, are they licensed under the BSRB, or do they have temporary out-of-state permit or something like that? So the next step is to look to see, are they practicing under the authority of SciPAC? And so I'll talk to the investigators and make sure they're keeping a list. And then I'll keep a list of any kind of complaints we have against individuals who are solely practicing in Kansas under the authority of SciPAC.
That would just be important to know, for when we do go back and assess that $25 charge, whether we move that up or down in the future would really, it'd be nice to have data to inform that rather than just, I don't remember any, So.
Yeah, and I think one thing too, probably on a different note, but somewhat affected, one thing about these compacts is individuals have been in favor of compacts because, in part, because they have multiple licenses, and licensed psychologists all renew their license in June of even numbered years. And so we do have a number of individuals who are out of state who continue to get licensed in Kansas. And so one thing we'll be tracking as well is how many of those current out-of-state licensees, how do those numbers compare once the renewal comes in June of this year? We always know there's going to be some people who drop off because of retirements or other factors, but we'll be taking a look to see if that's if it's in line with traditional decrease of licensure because of these issues, or if we see a more significant drop off that could be related to more people from out of state practicing under the compact authority instead of getting a license in Kansas.
Hey, David, I've got a quick question for you. Given that people are being, I think we're going to see more people wanting to get multiple licenses here through SciPAC. Has there been someone looked at the effect on malpractice insurance when this happens?
Not that I'm aware of.
I would think that if a malpractice agency found out, like the trust, that you were practicing in multiple states, that would have some effect on the way that they do risk assessment.
That's a really interesting thought. It's not something that I had thought about, but I'm not aware. I haven't heard of anything on those lines. But we don't have a lot of impact or a lot of interactions with the malpractice insurers.
Well, no, I would be surprised if we had it, but I was wondering if the SciPAC folks have actually looked at that.
Okay,
because that's where I would think it would be would come in handy.
Yeah, because one of the terms is that if you do practice in those states under the compact, you are agreeing that you're going to abide by the policies in those states. And we have had a couple of individuals who are practicing in Kansas, and they've had some questions about, does Kansas have a specific rule on this topic? One thing they were asking about is, are there any limitations specifically about what can be done over teleservices? And, there's really not specific statutes that's in Kansas. I think in some other states there are, but that may be one thing to, have for discussion or consideration. Are there things that should be limited to in-person versus teletherapy? So we've had some questions about that, and other states have developments in those areas, but as those issues come up, it's helpful for us to hear those things and continue to evaluate them here too.
Thanks.
So just to follow up on that statement, I have a couple of questions, I guess. The first is related to what you just said, David, which is like, I know from the psychiatry end of things that they do have some limitations that are going on with Medicare as far as initial assessments go, where those do need to be in person versus telehealth, and follow-up can be telehealth. As of right now, it doesn't seem like those regulations are in place for psychology or with assessment for psychology. Have we discussed at all if that is something that we need to be looking at as we move forward post-COVID is one question. The second question that I have is with regards to SciPAC, and I think that you kind of answered it, but I just want to confirm that I heard it correctly. With working with pre-surgical assessments for in my job, what we've run into a couple of times now is that we've had some assessments done by outside providers that have actually been completed telehealth, and the base provider was located in Texas and or in California, but the patient was located in Kansas. And this was preceding January 1st, where SciPAC for the state of Kansas was in place. And so then the question became, how does SciPAC, if we hadn't become live yet, obviously those individuals, even if they had I like the ethics associated with individuals that might be practicing under telehealth outside of the scope of what the SciPAC has to offer, and for us to clearly communicate to providers within the state of Kansas how we can make sure that they are denoting that they are licensed through SciPAC, if that makes sense.
Yeah, as far as that last part, there is something that licensees can obtain that they could put up to show that they have been approved by the SciPAC Commission to practice. That is one way to show, but then again, if you're doing teleservices, how do you reflect that unless it's behind you on the wall or something like that? You know, maybe part of the initial, information that you provide to a client. But I think some of your other questions, I think that these are good topics for discussion from the advisory committee. In terms of the topics the advisory committee has discussed, I forget exactly how you phrased it, but there was a question about, has the advisory committee or has the board discussed some of the in-person requirements for certain practices, and that may go a little bit beyond my time with the board, but I do think it's relevant. There's been a number of discussions recently that I've heard of from some of the annual meetings of different associations that are looking at existing policies with a view towards telehealth and teleservices to look to see, do we need new regulations or rules specifically because of telehealth? And is the current language and statute and regulation still applicable the same way given the prevalence of telehealth? So those are important things to consider. On a personal note, I would say that in terms of telehealth and maybe practices under telehealth, I considered asking the advisory committees to weigh in on that topic. I do think it's probably important that whatever the board decides to do in the realm of telehealth probably would be best to be uniform between the professions. I know there are differences between the professions, but I would like the board to consider looking at that specifically sometime this year. But as opposed to it being advisory committee work or board work, I think maybe the first step would have the board have a conversation on that topic to get some direction in terms of how they would want to proceed in looking at telehealth, because a lot of other states are definitely looking at it currently.
I think that's going to be a great conversation to have. And I think perhaps one of the differences across the different professions on the board is that licensed psychologists, and I suppose maybe master's level psychologists, will be doing standardized testing, intelligence testing, developmental testing, probably with greater frequency than some of the other professions. And Jessica, as you were talking about the assessments, I was, having kind of little nightmares in my head about different assessment instruments that the validity of which across telehealth could be potentially suspicious, right? Rodney, and you could speak to this in a lot of what you do, I think, or actually several of you could, but I was thinking about an ADOS or a WISC or a WACE, and what role we should have in maybe weighing in on whether that could be done via telehealth in a valid way.
Yeah. I personally just, if it's not meant to be deployed by telehealth, I don't use it that way, specifically for that, because I don't want to get into that kind of questioning. And I have to always think in terms of whatever I do, I have to be able to testify about. And so I'm always thinking, what would that be like if I was sitting on a stand and had to defend it? Because and no disrespect to David or any other lawyer in the room for what I'm about to say, I do have to think in terms of the chess match. Some of this stuff that we've talked about here, just briefly alluded to about assessments going over state lines. I just had a really long conversation with an attorney who wanted me to actually do an assessment on someone who was sitting in Florida and just thought it was just going to be a simple video conference and really hadn't thought through the particulars of you are practicing without a license if you do this incorrectly. And so a lot of what we're doing, and this is what I'm thinking about for next year, this year going forward, is we probably are going to have to do some education for the folks who do law, who use our services, so that they understand that they just can't use this anyway, because we can find ourselves in legal jeopardy if we don't know what we're doing very easily.
Well, and as a practical addition, Medicaid doesn't cover it unless it's face-to-face. So we had to stop testing the whole time we were remote because all of our clients are Medicaid. So it's just practically, I don't know how they're doing that.
I mean, is that just for just testing, or are we talking provision of all services?
It was just assessment. I logically understand it, but no, just assessment. Medicaid, they denied all the services that we attempted to do feedback right after the pandemic started, but that falls under psych eval, and they denied those services because they were not face-to-face, even though it was just feedback by Zoom.
Interesting.
I feel like we should check on that because working at the Med Center, they have been providing us the ability to do assessment because I do pre-surge evals, and the RVUs have been coming back for the Medicaid patients that are, doing bariatric or spinal cord stimulator or even head and neck or transplant services, which has become very important when we're talking about having somebody in the midst of a pandemic driving 8 hours in for an assessment where we can actually do it via telehealth using, while I understand WISC and like I'm using the MOCA blind, the PAI, and some other red cap surveys and the SciPAC, and all of that can be done very effectively using telehealth comparative to some of the other things that you guys have discussed, where I can understand the validity of it being very much questioned if it's done remote. I think this is a very interesting discussion that needs to probably occur, as David was saying, not just on the advisory, but there's some education that needs to be done with people who are making these decisions.
Yeah, I'd be curious also what CPT code you're using. Like, I'm wondering, but yes.
96130 and 96131, 96126, and 7.
Yeah. So that's interesting because, all of ours got denied. Now, granted, our type of testing is very different. So it is IQs and Woodcock-Johnsons and Rorschachs and TATs and a lot of manipulatives or things where we're using cards or stimulus of some sort. So, but they don't know that. So it's interesting that ours were denied.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's why I'm a little confused. And I'm wondering if it's still denied or if you guys, because there was a period of time where we were told that it wouldn't be approved, but then it was adjusted. But we're back in that same situation now of, as of January 1, psychiatry has been told that not like their initials have to be done in person. It will no longer be covered on the outpatient side if it's not in person for the initial.
Yeah, we got that too.
Yep. We're like in the midst of trying to figure out if that also will then include psychology needing to be in person for those initials and the impact that has on, I mean, and this is my bias, obviously, just from what I'm doing, but like, I really do not like to have people drive who are ill and immunocompromised 6 hours for an assessment, a 2-hour assessment where it could be completed at home appropriately.
Yeah.
So there's at least a couple of issues that we're probably not gonna resolve tonight, but I've got them written down. Regulations, potential regulations regarding what can and shouldn't be done via telehealth, and that will obviously include some conversation about what's paid for, but our primary job is what's in the best interest of the public and what protects the public the most, right? Independent of what's paid for. The second would be the provenance of SciPAC credentials. How would the public, where would the public know to look? David mentioned if there was something on the wall I was thinking about perhaps something in the informed consent to treat document, right? And so if providers knew that the expectation was that there is that notification provided, that would be a convenient place to put it, I think. And if consumers knew that that would be the place to look for it, I'm sure there's other options, but those are at least two takeaways that I'm getting from this. Were there others that I didn't write down quickly enough? Okay. Okay. Were there other SciPAC related things? That was the SciPAC report. Seems like the other old business was update on this continuing education requirements. You gave us an update on that. Was there more that we were going to need to talk about, David?
I think I summarized most of that in the conversation about the bill. But the other advisory committees did have the opportunity to weigh in, and the board asked if any other professions wanted to move forward and be included in the bill as well. And they did not want to require it in law under that discussion. And so that's why the reason why the psychology profession is in there as the profession wanting to make that requirement right now. So I did just want to add that as a note in terms of why that is one profession in the bill, because I assume I'll be asked that question as well. In terms of why is the psychology profession in here when the other ones are not. So
yeah, it's good that I'm not testifying. I think you can always just say that our professional organizations at the larger level are very much in favor of this, and it's consistent with both our training models as well as with the expectations of and I think what you have in your written testimony should clarify that, because you've mentioned the ASPPB, you've mentioned other states moving in this direction for psychology, and you've mentioned the APA having this as a priority for us and our own values. So I think
I think that's something that I included in my testimony. Depending on how many people testify at the hearing tomorrow, sometimes they give us very little time. So I wanted to make sure that I included that in the testimony for the committee. But I think it will be important for the committee to know that, there wasn't originally a request originally from, the president of KPA and the chair of the diversity committee requesting this on behalf of the profession, because I think there could be a question coming to me saying, why are you targeting licensed psychology profession to add additional requirements for licensure? Because sometimes they look at those additional requirements and they might say, is it going to make it difficult for someone to become licensed or continue to practice in Kansas? And I think it's important for us to put out there that this was a requirement from representatives from that profession, and it's consistent with what a lot of other states are moving towards, and like you mentioned there too. But that is something I'll definitely talk about as time allows in the committee tomorrow.
Yeah, the good news is I think KPA will have your back since this was one of their requests as well. So I don't think we're going to get. I would be surprised to get opposition for that from psychology anyway. So. Okay, so that brings us down to new business. And so you've got 3 documents, I believe, in your packet for tonight. There's 3 documents in there, but David was going to talk about some training issues for advisory committee members. And then, so that's where we go next.
Okay. Yes. So at the January board meeting, the board did ask, I sought their guidance. Last year, we had legal representation from the board come to the advisory committees and go through pretty extensive training, and that training lasted about an hour and a half. So this year, I'm going to be taking the training myself. So I'll be putting that on here. And actually, there's 4 documents, although one of them is very small. I did include the document that legal representation provided to us last year. But I'll start with 2 of the new documents that were approved at the January board meeting, the expectations of board members, and then the new advisory committee policy. The board did indicate to go ahead and do board member training and advisory committee training at the same time. And I know that some of you have already heard some of this material, but there are changes in these documents. And for those of you that are new to the advisory committee, I think it's important to understand really the role of the agency and also to understand how the advisory committee fits within the overall role of the board. And so there is, the staff here at the office, there is the board, and there are the advisory committees that really assist the work of the board, and it all kind of works in combination. So I'm going to talk about some items that affect the board first, because the advisory committee policy has a statement that says the rules affecting board members should also apply to advisory committee members. So I think that's why it's important to know what's expected of the board, and then understand that as an advisory committee member, these same expectations in a lot of ways should apply to you. If there are some things that are only going to really apply to board members, I'll highlight those where individuals can read more about those, but I'll try to move fast. And towards the end of the training, we'll be able to go really quickly through that big document. So first, let's look at the document. Is titled Expectations of Board Members. And so this was confirmed at the January board meeting. It's important to know that the overall authority of this document is that it falls after the statutes and regulations or any other kind of federal rules. This is something the board decided to adopt on its own. The mission statement of the board, or the BSRB, in accordance with the intent of the Kansas legislature, is to protect and serve consumers of mental health services and the professionals that offer them through the issuance of licenses, resolution of complaints, and creation of appropriate regulations accomplished through efficiency, fairness, and respect to all those involved. So I'll probably say this several times during the training, but the BSRB was created in statute as first and foremost a public protection agency. And so that should be your number one filter. We should be looking to see, are the actions we're taking, are they directed to really assist the public? And some of the things that we're going to be doing are going to help the convenience of licensees as well. And that's important, but our number one priority should be to members of the public who receive the services. The guiding principles of the board is that the licensed mental health providers are qualified, competent, and professional, that the BSRB shall expect equitable and fair treatment in relation to licensing activities, disciplinary processes, and administrative regulations. The BSRB should provide all services in a manner that is timely, cost-effective, courteous, and competent. We should be guided and led by ethical principles, clear policies, and progressive thinking and strategic decision-making, and we should respect the dignity and worth of all individuals. In terms of the services that the BSRB should provide, we should process license applications and license renewals in a timely manner. We should take disciplinary action when appropriate. We should provide timely information to the public, and we should maintain rules and regulations and statutes. On page 2 of that document, it talks about the code of conduct, and the board adopted this and stressed that there were 3 main things they wanted to expect of board members. And the first is integrity. And the board identified some items under integrity, such as having no criminal or professional misconduct record, nor commit acts that would lead to investigations or complaints. Board members should not possess sound moral principles. Board members should have courage of convictions to withstand pressures to be swayed from the public protection agenda. Board members should be honest about personal agendas and leave them outside of the boardroom. Should reveal any actual or perceived conflicts of interest and appropriately recuse themselves from decisions or actions of those of interest. Should not represent their personal opinion as that of the board, and should be limited to 1 unexcused absence per year. Under conflicts of interest, a member of the BSRB should guide against conflicts of interest by having no personal financial benefit as a result of service to the BSRB, except for things like sustenance and mileage. And board members are paid a small amount for each meeting that they attend. Board members should also note that if they have conflicts of interest according to a stated criteria, they should refrain from voting on a matter. They should disclose any relationship to any other agency or individual involved with the BSRB and be excluded from matters involving such a conflict. On page 3, they should serve, they can serve as part of an organization working in any way with the BSRB. If they do so, they should inform the chair of that relationship. Board members should not accept any gifts, promotional items received as part of their affiliation with the agency for personal use, and also should not use the agency's name or agency information for personal gain. The last item that they wanted to specifically highlight was confidentiality, and they specifically noted that 2 items in particular should remain confidential. First, any discussion that occurs in executive session or any discussion concerning actual or potential litigation. And there will be a few more things that are regarded as under the confidentiality. In terms of board meetings, the board is composed of 12 board members. All board members are appointed by the governor to serve a 4-year term. The governor can reappoint those members to an additional 4-year term, but that is the extent of how long a board member can serve. They can serve at most 8 years. The governor also has the authority to remove board members, and so that is not something that the board may do. The ability to remove a board member in statute, it talks about 3 main reasons the governor could remove a board member, and that is malfeasance, misfeasance, and nonfeasance. And these are very legal terms, but in a big picture perspective, essentially, if you have a legal responsibility to do something and you act in a way that is a bad action that goes against your legal responsibilities, that is something that would be seen as malfeasance. If you do something that is a significant mistake and it violates your legal responsibilities, that would be misfeasance. And if you just refuse to act or don't act in a way in which you're supposed to act because of a duty you have legally, that would be nonfeasance. So those are general terms to kind of explain those 3 terms in statute. But the statute does indicate that of the 12 board members, 8 are professional members, and then 4 are public members, and those are outlined in statute. The board meetings take place every other month, unless the board determines otherwise. During legislative session, the board has provided direction to me that should any bills come up that they might need to weigh in on and meet to take a position on to ask for testimony, they can hold quick meetings. And so in general, the board has a full board meeting every other month. The document further defines the authority of the chair of the board and also that of the vice chair of the board. And it talks briefly to emergency executive succession in the event that should be something the board would need to do. On page 4, it outlines the relationship between the board and the executive director. And I think it's important for you to know what it says about those things. So I'll go into detail on those because it's important to know, my responsibility in terms of this document to the board. The executive director will communicate any personnel matters that should be addressed by the board to the chair of the board. And then the chair of the board will present these board-related issues to the board, and the executive director will communicate to the staff the board wishes, intentions, and policies. And that last item I do at monthly staff meetings we have here at the office. In terms of delegation to the executive director shall be the administrative head of the organization, serving at all times under the board. The executive director is responsible for implementing and executing the policies and activities approved by the board, and he shall assist with the development of the overall program and recommend policies and activities for consideration by the board. And the executive director shall have sole authority to employ, eliminate, and fix the duties and salaries of other employees or independent contractors of the organization, subject to policies, regulations, and limitations approved by the state of Kansas. And I can tell you in terms of any hires or any salaries, those all have to be submitted to the governor's office, and they have to be approved, not just the amount, but also the specific person we wish to hire. So there is a process in place for that. In terms of executive expectations, the executive director shall keep the board advised of BSRB activities by issuing a report to the board at each full board meeting that summarizes all pertinent information. And the executive director shall prepare the agenda for the board meeting in consultation with the board chair. Additionally, the executive director shall prepare the agenda in consultation with the board chair for the annual board retreat, which usually happens in September, as I mentioned before. And then in terms of monitoring the executive director's performance, the document states the board shall, when necessary, utilize executive session to discuss issues concerning the executive director. And the board shall also formally evaluate the performance of the executive director each calendar year and on an annual basis thereof, with emphasis on whether set outcomes are attained. And one other item I wanted to note here, in this document, it talks a lot about the responsibilities of the agency. Another really important responsibility of the agency involves investigations and discipline. There is a separate document on the board's website specifically involving the investigation and disciplinary process. It's under the policies section of our website. Just to let you know about that process, should we receive a complaint, we also call them reports of alleged violation because they have to be linked to the statute or regulation. our investigative team here in the office, we have one full-time investigator, one part-time investigator. They will review those and then begin an examination and investigation, and then forward those when they are ready to be reviewed to a complaint review committee. And the complaint review committee is made up of 5 board members, a licensed psychologist, a social worker, 2 public members, and another member representing the other licenses on the board. And as I mentioned, they meet, there's a separate policy on how they handle those investigations and how they review those cases and make determinations. And they meet every other month, usually in the off month in between the regular full meetings of the board. The second document I wanted to highlight is the advisory committee policy. It's a 2-page document. And some of you have already seen this document because when you went through the process to identify new candidates for the advisory committee, you went through some of these details in terms of selection of advisory committee members. There were a number of changes to this document, and so I wanted to highlight some of those. The advisory committee policy really outlines the mission of the board and also how the advisory committee fits within that. Members of the advisory committee serve at the pleasure of the board, and they support the board in carrying out its mission to protect the public. Actions pertaining to informing, licensing, and disciplining of those persons regulated by the board are the methods for accomplishing that goal. And what the advisory committees are asked to do is address issues referred to it by the board through the advisory committee chair or the executive director. And the committee may also suggest issues it believes the board should consider by referring those through the chair of the advisory committee. In terms of the structure of the advisory committee, the chair of advisory committees will be a member of the board. If the profession is represented on the board, the chair of the advisory committee will be the board member licensed in that discipline of the committee and appointed by the governor to represent that discipline on the board. It notes that any other board members appointed by the governor to represent that discipline on the board will serve as a member of the advisory committee, and that a public member will also be a member of the advisory committee. There will be a minimum of 3 members and a maximum of 10 additional members appointed. It notes that the executive director will be a non-voting ex officio member. The assistant director and licensing manager is recommended to attend, and that legal counsel for the board through the attorney general's office may attend as their attendance is requested by the agency. Terms of service are 2-year terms, and advisory committee members can be reappointed for up to 4 different terms, so they can serve the same amount of time on the board. It's just a shorter period of time for each term. I know in the past, some of those terms kind of blended together, but we're going to be having those come up as they become due this next year. And so if members come up and they wish to continue to serve in the advisory committee, those will be reviewed by the chair of the board and then considered for reappointment to the advisory committee. The chair of the BSRB has the authority to both appoint individuals to the advisory committee or to remove individuals from the advisory committee. And it says here that the policies and procedures under which the BSRB board members are expected to operate will apply also to the advisory committee members. And so that's really why I wanted to stress some of those things that the board members are expected to do and to uphold, because those also apply to you in large part as advisory committee members. There's some language below in the bottom of page 1 that talks about selection of advisory committee members. It does note that anyone can nominate an individual for consideration of joining the advisory committee. And it also notes that in reviewing nominations, the committee should work to ensure there is diverse representation, including but not limited to geographic setting, gender, culture, and ethnicity. And members should provide representation to the different levels of licensing for that discipline. And those members should be selected from among public and private practitioners and educators. In terms of the other information in this document, in terms of how advisory committee members are selected and reviewed, that really in large part has not changed. And then there's some information about how new members will be notified by the executive director. The third document I just wanted to touch upon for the training, I wanted to make you just aware of this item in case you do have questions or someone talks to you and brings a concern to you that might involve the BSRB. It's a document that's new to the website, is approved by the board in January. It's called Guidelines for Public Attendees of Meetings. And so it clarifies in this document that meetings of the BSRB and subcommittee meetings of the BSRB, such as advisory committees, fall under the Kansas Open Meeting Act and are open to the public. And the Kansas Open Meeting Act does not require state agencies to provide public comment to individuals. However, as part of the BSRB's public protection mission, the agency values the receipt of information and input from members of the public. To ensure that all individuals are treated in a consistent and respectful manner, the agency has created this guidance document to provide general procedures for individuals attending board meetings and advisory committee meetings, as well as general guidance on topics relevant to the public comment at these meetings. And so in this document, it includes some general guidelines to follow when we have in-person meetings, some additional guidelines to follow when we have virtual meetings, and then some regular guidelines for any type of meetings, such as things like making sure cell phones and other devices which produce noise are turned off and to avoid disruption. On page 2, it outlines the procedures for public comment. It notes that the chair of the board and advisory committees will determine whether public comment will be allowed at the meeting. If time for public comment is determined and permitted, the chair will have authority to determine the amount of time available for public comment. And then it outlines how individuals can request to provide public comment ahead of the meeting. It indicates that we don't require there to be written comments with the public comment, but that it is valuable because it helps the members of the committee have a better understanding. And if there is discussion at the meeting, they're more informed to participate in that discussion. It does indicate that at the conclusion of the public comment, the chair may allow time for questions or may move to the next item on the agenda. And then the last part on page 2 is especially important, and I wanted to highlight that for the advisory committee. It says it's called Topics Relevant for Public Comment. And it says, as a state agency created by the Kansas legislature, the BSRB is governed by statutes and regulations. Information presented to the board or advisory committees should be relevant to those statutes or regulations governing the agency. The chair reserves the right to limit testimony that is, in the judgment of the chair, not relevant to the matters germane to the board or advisory committees. Common examples of past public comment topics include requested changes to the statutes or regulations relating to qualifications for licensure, fees, continuing education, or unprofessional conduct of practitioners. It also notes in this section that there's other information that the agency highly values. For example, a potential item which might involve a complaint against a current practitioner. However, there is a defined process for how the office needs to handle those types of complaints. And in order for us to make sure that we are treating both members of the public and licensees respectfully and responsibly and consistently, we have to receive that information in the appropriate format. So the document describes that we have to receive certain information by someone filling out a report of alleged violation form so that we can investigate that properly and then evaluate if there has been a violation of the statutes or regulations. And it makes it very clear that we are not dismissing that. It's just not the appropriate subject matter for public comment, just so we can ensure that we are, as I said before, being appropriate to both the person bringing that allegation and also the licensee. So we have to handle those things in certain ways. So we have that posted and it's available in case anyone has questions on that. Oh, go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, David, I really appreciate that document, and I know that I trust that it's going to help things. I mean, there have been meetings where it would have been nice to have that document at the ready, right? One question I've got as the current chair on the time limits and on the topics. There's not a mechanism in Zoom that I'm aware of that shows a countdown clock. And that sounds so, I don't know, I feel like I'm being punitive somehow, but it might be helpful because oftentimes when we have people providing public comment and we say the chair grants 5 minutes, 5 minutes turns into more than 5 minutes. Is there in your experience, has there been a more useful way for the chair to help enforce that better? I'm just, other than just saying, you've been talking for 5 minutes, please stop.
Right. Yeah. So, it's tricky. Yeah. Cause you want to be respectful to people and some individuals don't really keep track of time like that. I do know that there's some other agencies that essentially when they start the clock, that starts. And then as soon as that time is up, they completely mute that person. So it really comes down to kind of the discretion of the chair. There's not a standard way in that document that talks about how someone will be asked to stop, except that it does say that the person speaking should be respectful of the time limitation that they've been given. I think that probably would just depend on the chair of how they wanted it to be handled. I would be happy if a chair asked me, to go ahead and interrupt them on behalf of the committee, just to let them know that, we appreciate what they're talking about, but to make sure we cover all the items in the agenda, we need to move forward. So it's just kind of the preference of the chair, really.
And that probably makes more sense than what I was about to say, but I don't know if it's feasible, but if you use a breakout room, those have an automatic shut off. It gives you a 60-second warning, and then it kicks everybody back to the main room, period. So, and you can assign everyone in the meeting to the breakout room. It's by choice. So you can assign literally everyone to move over to the breakout room, do your public comments, time limit it at whatever you want, 30 minutes, 25, doesn't matter. And then it will send everyone back at the end.
That is brilliant, Abby. Thank you. I had forgotten about that. When I have had to teach via Zoom, I use those, but somehow I wasn't transferring that information from the classroom to the committee meeting.
So that's the same thought. I was like, that's how we get the students to stop talking.
Yeah, right. That would be a way of doing it. The other would be just when the chair provides, the invitation to provide comment, just to let them know that the executive director or the chair will let them know when they have 1 minute left at the beginning of it, as a respectful way of just, anyway, that's minutia, but I thought it might be nice to have that conversation just briefly before there's public comment, so that we don't have to figure it out when there's going to be public, when we have a guest here providing public comment.
That's a good idea. Yep. Well, I think I'll move to the last document, and that's the large document. It's titled Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board and Advisory Committee Members Orientation. This was given to all the advisory committees last spring. It was from Janet Arndt, who was previously our primary assistant attorney general. So I'll highlight some of these. This is going to speak broadly to how agencies are created and some of the different official acts that we follow. So I will touch upon some of these topics briefly, and you're welcome to read through this in document. I think it is a good document, and I would read through it closer, but for the purposes of our limited time, I'll just touch upon some of these things and then answer any questions if you do have questions about the document. So first, it is important to know that Kansas regulates the professions, including the BSRB, and as a licensing board, we are created by the legislature for the purpose of ensuring that licensed professionals are competent and don't pose a risk. A professional licensing board is created by legislation, which established the form, mission, powers, functions, tools of implementation, and enforcement. When we call the board a creature of statute, it means that the board power is dependent upon its authorizing statutes, and then we fulfill this in greater detail through the process of making regulations. Aside from the statutes, the board is also held to not violate any of the federal laws or the constitutional provisions, such as equal protection and due process rights, which prohibit a board from acting in a manner which results in disparate or inconsistent treatment of persons who are similarly situated. On page 2, I'll go ahead and note briefly that the Kansas legislature does still retain control over certain aspects of our licensing board. For example, the legislature created the BSRB. They could also repeal the enabling legislation and cause us to not exist as an agency anymore. The board also receives a legislative appropriation in terms of expending the monies collected. And you might think that the state of Kansas doesn't really give us any money. And on one hand, that's true. We are a fee-funded agency, and we operate primarily from licensing fees collected by those individuals that we regulate. And in fact, by statute, we have to turn over 10% of all revenue to the state, which is about $70,000 to $80,000 every year. However, each year we have to come before the legislature, and they indicate how much of the fee fund we are limited to spend. And so they do establish a limitation in the appropriations legislation every year. And if they wanted to, they could set that appropriation as a zero amount, which means we couldn't spend money even if we did have it in the fund. So there are ways that legislature can still control us through passing legislation, controlling the amount of money that the agency may spend. Or they can also create legislation that would change the makeup, scope, and powers of the board to transform the agency into something entirely different. There is some language that talks about certain statutes say the board shall do something, or sometimes it says may do something. And it notes that the shalls are a requirement, whereas the mays involve sort of a weighing approach and consideration of other factors. There's also some language in this document that notes the general purpose, whether explicit or implied, of a licensing board is to secure for the people of Kansas the services of competent, trustworthy practitioners, and to protect the public against unprofessional, unauthorized, or unqualified practitioners. And the purpose of a licensing board is not to promote or protect the profession as a whole. Those functions typically lie with a private professional association. And it talks about how we can go about being a good agency and fulfilling our responsibilities. Under the functions and duties of a licensing board, we essentially have powers that mirror the executive, judicial, and legislative branches of government. We have an enabling act, and we have administrative procedures. We follow the Kansas Open Meeting Act and the Kansas Open Records Act for most of the items that we deal with. Under judicial authority, we have the ability to enforce the enabling act by holding quasi-judicial hearings to make findings of fact and conclusions of law and determining whether those facts have proved a violation of the law. We go by the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act in certain situations. And then under a quasi-legislative authority, we are asked to adopt rules and order and regulations in order to implement and interpret the enabling acts with more detail in terms of its specific requirements. Under the statutes, regulations, and policies, we are, by our statutory authority, we are asked to enforce the statutes and regulations at times, and also adopt internal policies to go ahead and have consistent approaches to these things. And then it's important for the board to understand the difference between statutes, regulations, and policies. Statutes are the result of bills that go before the legislature and are signed into law. They cannot be changed unless there is another law that is passed or the court strikes those down. And regulations, on the other hand, is language that is adopted by the board to implement and carry out the purposes of a particular statute. And the board's authority to adopt regulations is derived from statute. So we can't just adopt regulations on any topic. It has to fit under an existing statutory authority. On the next page, it outlines how to determine whether to adopt a regulation. And it talks about the need for regulation, whether the statutory authority to adopt the regulation exists, and then it outlines the procedures to adopt the regulation. And you're welcome to read more about those procedures, but I'll go ahead and move to page 6. It notes that policies may be adopted by the board to provide information on its internal operations, and also that boards can adopt guidance documents that state the board's current approach or interpretation of law, or general statements of policy that describe how and when the board will exercise its discretionary functions. And it talks about guidance documents must be published on the agency's website, which the new document on public meetings and guidance for those public attendees is published. In terms of effectiveness as a board member on page 6, or as an advisory committee member, one thing that's recommended is to read through the statutes. And on the BSRB website, we have a list of all of the statutes for each of the professions. We also have a list of all of the regulations for each of the professions, and those are linked to the Reviser of Statutes website. So as time allows, go ahead and read through those and become familiar with the items in the statutes and regulations for the licensed psychology profession. Be on alert for agency policies and internal procedures which may be inconsistent with or conflict with the board statutes and regulations, or which affect requirements for applicants or licensees. So if you do see inconsistencies, it's a responsibility to identify those so that we can go and examine those to see if those should be changed. It's important to ensure that decisions are within the authority granted. You should be willing to initiate action to amend statutes or modify regulations. Remember, the purpose of imposing discipline against licensees is to encourage compliance with the law and protect the public. Most of the work of the disciplinary committee is generally under the complaint review committee, but that could involve you at a certain point. And always be mindful that the role of the board is to protect the public and not the licensee. On page 7, there's some general information about conflicts of interest. And we've already basically covered those, but the idea to take from this is that If there's an existing conflict of interest, or you think there might be a perception of conflict of interest, you are encouraged to go ahead and err on the side of caution and recuse yourself from a vote, just to make things cleaner. Even if it means that there's not enough members to vote on a topic and the vote has to be delayed to a future meeting, that's what would be encouraged to make sure that we avoid any types of conflict of interest. On page 8, it indicates some items that would be under confidentiality. A lot of information that are the items that we discuss are not confidential. This meeting currently is being broadcast on the agency's YouTube channel. Even when we are in person in a boardroom, the boardroom is open and those meetings are recorded, at least the audio for the meetings, and that information is available to the public in terms of being able to request that information. But in terms of items that would be confidential, it's important to remember that even if your membership ends as a board member or an advisory committee member, you are still expected to continue to keep that confidentiality of things that were confidential. Some of the things that are confidential: executive sessions during an open meeting. So if the board goes into an executive session or the advisory committee goes into an executive session, the items discussed in the executive session should be kept confidential. Additionally, deliberations after a hearing between the board and legal counsel for the board should be kept confidential. Also, if there's any conversation with legal counsel about pending litigation or conversation in executive session about personnel matters, those are all things to be kept confidential. On page 9, there's some comments about ex parte communication that largely won't involve you as advisory committee members. It mainly involves board members as it relates to hearings for licensees, but there's information to read there as it relates. The important thing to take from that is that it's a policy that tries to ensure fairness, to make sure that if there are two parties in an active event such as a hearing, you want to make sure that they are both receiving the same information at the same time, and that items come before the board from both parties at the same time in terms of deciding those types of issues. With that, I'll move to the bottom of page 9 under professional activities. Board members or advisory committee members may hold office in a professional or trade association of a regulated profession, but may not lobby for or cast votes regarding a matter that would impact the professional association or the board member's office in that association. The board member may not use his or her position on the board to further the interest of the professional association or his or her office in that association. So if you do believe that there is a matter that would be a conflict of interest, and it's okay to serve on those associations, but if there is something that would involve promoting that association, you need to make sure which hat you're wearing in this meeting and make sure that you are doing your best to represent the board or the BSRB and make sure that you're not advocating for the association when you're serving as a member of the advisory committee or as a board member. It's also important to know under this that there are some rules about open meetings, and we'll cover those a little bit later. In terms of other conduct to be aware of on page 10, make sure that when you are having conversations or speaking to groups that you do not identify your personal thoughts or beliefs as the board's beliefs, and try not to avoid speaking on the board's behalf or the advisory committee's behalf. It's okay to say that you are a member of that committee and you can say what happened, but if they ask you, how would the board do this, or how would the board feel about this, just keep in mind that you don't talk for the board or the advisory committee. The board delegates authority to me in terms of bill hearings to speak for the board and the actions that the board has taken, but you want to make sure that you're not speaking on behalf of those groups. On page 10, we follow the Kansas Open Meeting Act for most meetings of the board and the advisory committees. And under the Kansas Open Meeting Act, it allows the public to observe governmental entities making decisions, and meetings are open to the public because the representative government is dependent upon an informed electorate. The board meetings and advisory committee meetings in general are open to the public unless they fall under a different provision, which we'll talk about a little bit later. There's some information in general about the Kansas Open Meeting Act. It's also important to know that we don't have to have an official meeting for something to be declared a meeting. A meeting is defined on page 10 as any gathering or assembly in person through the use of telephone or other medium for interactive communication by a majority of the members of an agency or public body subject to the act for the purposes of discussing the business or affairs of the public body or agency. So it doesn't have to be in person. Also, it could be at a social function, but just keep in mind, if there's a majority of the members of a group or committee that falls under this, and you are talking about business that would be related to the board or the advisory committee, that is something that could fall underneath the Kansas Open Meeting Act, and it could be a violation of that act. It's okay if you are at an event, just make sure to avoid doing something that would be interpreted as something that should be open to the public because of your role as an advisory committee member or as a board member. It also doesn't have to be an official vote to be discussion. It could just be conversation. And then there's some additional items here to clarify what items may include as well. One thing that's commonly missed under this is you also want to make sure you don't have chain communication between members. So perhaps you only spoke with one member, but if they forward that to another member and next forwarded to another member, you could end up involving the majority of the members of the group in a discussion, even though you all didn't talk to each other at the same time. So you just want to be careful. And the best way to do it is just to save those conversations and discussions for board meetings or advisory committee meetings. Now, it's okay for you to have one-on-one conversation. There's nothing wrong with that. But if there's any question, just reach out to me and let me know. As staff of the board, we are able to help out any individuals on the board or advisory committee. So never feel like you can't contact me with any information or forward any information for me. And I'm happy to clarify if I believe something might be a violation or what you should do to avoid those potential problems. On page 12, it talks about potential violations of COMA. Those are civil actions investigated by the Attorney General. On page 13, it talks about the Kansas Open Record Act, and it outlines what items are included as records. We do fall under the Kansas Open Records Act, and it's important to note as an advisory committee that a lot of the items that are forwarded back and forth are going to be open. Should we receive an official request under the Kansas Open Meeting Act, we would have to turn over those documents. And when people think of records, sometimes they just think of specific files or documents, but it could include something like an email or a text message even. Now, certain information is protected, things like social security numbers, certain address information, but just keep in mind that a lot of the things that you send back and forth could be interpreted as a record. So we don't have a duty to confidentiality under a lot of these potential communications. So just be cautious and be careful when you communicate information back and forth with the board's office, because some of those and most of those would be subject to a core request under the right conditions. And then it outlines how we would respond to core request, and then some of the information as far as why core exists. And it's also not a criminal act. On page 15, it notes that it's a civil act. On page 16, it talks about the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act. And what's important about the CAPA, or the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act, is that it is in the statute for the professions under the board. It outlines procedural rights and procedural duties, and it is outside of open meetings in large part. So items under CAPA would involve things that would be of a more personal note in terms of reviewing the licensure application. So it's not a meeting to discuss the process to evaluate applications. These would be things that involve specific conversations about someone who had applied for licensure. Or in certain cases, it could involve someone who has an administrative proceeding involving discipline. So those would also fall under the CAPA. And under those, there's a different set of rules, and it's not open like a meeting would be under the COMA. One other item I wanted to touch upon in terms of these, in terms of this document is found on page 21, and that is a note about the Kansas Tort Claims Act. So the Kansas Tort Claims Act generally governs the liability of the state of Kansas and its agencies and employees. An employee includes a member of a board or committee of a governmental entity, including elected or appointed officials and persons acting on behalf or in service of a governmental entity in any official capacity, whether or not without compensation. And it has been ruled that board members would fall under this, but I don't believe advisory committee members would fall under this protection from the Kansas Tort Claims Act. And the basic rule of the Kansas Tort Claims Act is that vicarious liability for any actionable wrongful act or omission of the government employees within the course and scope of their employment, subject to affirmative grants of immunity that may exist on a case-by-case basis. So if you're sued for an act that occurred within the scope of your duties as a board member, you are entitled to have the Attorney General's office defend you at no cost. And there's a process for that. mainly on page 21 and 22. You have to request that representation. It has to be something that you did within the scope of your duty as a board member or as an employee. But if you do those and request that representation, in most cases, the Attorney General's office is obligated under that act to go ahead and defend you in certain civil cases. So I understand that was a lot of information. I tried to summarize it as best I could and go quickly while also highlighting the important things that I think you needed to hear. But I'm happy to stand for any questions. And should you think of things after the meeting today, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to come back to you and have any additional conversations on those topics. But I'll stop now and see if there's any questions on any of the training material.
That is a lot of information, but over the course of your time on here, you'll see the value of it. Just touching on a couple of things just that I've encountered, as a member of the advisory committee and as a member of the board, you will get requests from the public. It just will happen. Someone will email you, "Oh, I know you're on the advisory committee. What would you think about this?" Let me just encourage you to always send those straight to David. That's my rule. Someone sends me, would the board take this up? Would the board consider this? My response is, thank you for your comments. I forwarded it to the executive director and we'll deal with it in due course, and that rather than you speaking on behalf of the committee or on the board saying, yeah, we'll take a look at that. Just push the easy button. This is one of the places in the world where you can just push the easy button and send it to David. And that's just my advice. So anyway, for what it's worth. Okay, I think that gets us to discussion of committee work for the upcoming year. I have written down a couple of things that just have come up in tonight's meeting, and I think that there's about to be another one that's actually on the agenda regarding unprofessional conduct. David, remind me, what else were we specifically thinking about for committee work that we want to try to get to this year?
Well, I'll kind of jump ahead to the unprofessional conduct.
Yeah.
So the reason that I asked to have that put on the agenda and I wanted to bring it to the advisory committee is last year, there were a couple of bills that were introduced in the legislature that really targeted regulations of state agencies. And they came from the perspective of basically insinuating that a lot of state agencies had regulations that maybe had not been reviewed in a long time, that were outdated. And it really called for a lot of those to be put in statute, or for agencies to really go through all of these in a really quick time frame to justify if those should be kept in there or gotten rid of. And while I don't support the complete thought behind the bills, I do think that there is merit to making sure that each of the advisory committees reviews the regulations and statutes and the language to determine are these regulations still current? Is there outdated terminology? Are there things that potentially are missing from these regulations or things that need to be added or removed from the regulations? And I thought the best place to start would be to provide the unprofessional conduct, since we are a public protection agency. And so I thought taking a piece of our regulations and giving it to the advisory committee as homework, in a sense, between now and the next meeting, to go back and really review all the language that's currently in the rules of unprofessional conduct to evaluate, is this the correct regulation that we should have for the licensed psychology profession? And this is not unique to licensed psychology. This is something that I'm asking each of the different advisory committees to do. And I'm starting with the unprofessional conduct regulations to have each of the members review it and bring back thoughts at the next meeting. But the idea is that this is a first step in an overall process to go ahead and make sure that each of the advisory committees is familiar with all of the statutes and regulations and has had an opportunity recently to review and make any adjustments or recommendations, because essentially the advisory committees make recommendations to the board, and it's the board who takes the official action. But since the advisory committees represent that profession and it's made up mostly of licensees in that profession, I thought it'd be a good place to start with the unprofessional conduct regulations.
I think that is a good place to start. For those who might not be real familiar with reading regulations, I'm going to, and if I'm speaking down to anybody, please forgive me. That's not my intent. I'm just going to share what it took me a long time to figure out. When these are outlined using numbers and letters, it's completely backwards. These legislatures do this in a backwards way. Focus on the little letters. Little a is more important, is where it starts. And then there's big numbers and big letters. It doesn't make sense to me. It seems to me it ought to be Roman numeral 1 and then capital letter A. And, that's how I outline things. It goes completely backwards here. It starts with so if you're looking at the document, in fact, can I share my screen, David?
Yes, you should be able to do that.
Sure. So this is what and actually I do this. I have a whole collection of statutes and regulations in a file that I have marked up. I just did this one just real quick this afternoon. But what I have underlined, that's kind of the header, the way I would think about it. So in the unprofessional conduct regulation, there are A through O specific things that are considered, right? So practicing psychology in an incompetent manner, and then it goes to big 1, 2, 3. Okay, the second big thing to consider is little letter B, practicing with impaired judgment, right? And so that's if you follow that, and then you go, so C is engaging in harmful dual role relationships. Okay, well, there are 3 kinds of those. The first is sexual advances toward, right? And then there's a couple of examples. The second harmful dual relationship is financial. The third harmful dual role relationship is exercising undue influence over, right? And so I don't need to belabor this, but that would be my recommendation for your homework that David gave you, is to start with just kind of making sure you get the roadmap. Again, this is what I do every time I know there's going to be a discussion of a regulation or a statute, because they're all written in from my perspective, the outline is flipped. Why is that, David? Is there a reason that you can speak to as an attorney or a person very familiar with legislation? Is it intended to confuse us, or is there a reason?
I think the most precise explanation I can say is it's tradition, and they've tried to stay consistent with the tradition.
Okay.
I can't really defend a lot of the legislative language, because in statute, they tend to not capitalize a lot of things that definitely should be capitalized. So some of this is just a past tradition that for consistency, they've continued to follow that process. Okay.
So as we consider our homework, right, and we have about 2 months to do it, so that's good. If you don't mind going through specifically thinking about how dual role relation or how unprofessional conduct would be characterized, it would probably be worthwhile looking at the updated APA Code of Conduct. We cannot delegate authority to the APA Code of Conduct, but it can be used to inform our thinking, right? So we can't put in regulation or statute that someone who violates the APA Code of Conduct is in violation of this Kansas, because that's, as I understand it, unlawful delegation of authority. But we can use our updated understanding, because the ethics code has been updated, I believe, 3 or 4 times since this regulation was put into effect. And so, we should probably consider whether our current regulations are consistent with our understanding of current ethical guidelines in the practice of psychology. Thoughts or questions? I'm imagining a process where this would be a significant chunk of our business in April when we meet. And what I might do is we just go through little a through little o as kind of our as our stepping stones, right? So we could talk about harmful dual relationships. We'll then talk about informed consent. We'll then talk about, each of these in turn. And if we think they need to be looked at more carefully, we can. If it looks perfect, if we get to the end of our homework assignment, and this is absolutely what the regulations should look like, that is an okay outcome. We're not looking to create work for anybody, but we do want to evaluate these. Questions or concerns or thoughts? David, did I overstep anything there?
No, I think that was great.
Yeah, I've got a quick question for you. Because of the line of what I do, I have people who invite me to stay before the BSRB because they're complaining about something. And I find that the unprofessional conduct statute is the one that gets thrown at me all the time. And I wondered whether or not this is the statute that's almost like the catch-all. Do we find that most of the regulation violations tend to fall into certain groupings or clusters of statute?
Well, so I do think most of the violations would fall under the professional conduct, and it's really a regulation versus a statute. So
Right.
kind of a little difference there. But I do think, yeah, most of the violations generally would fall into these professional conduct regulations. It's possible to have a different regulation that might be violated, but most of them would fall under one of these provisions.
Has the board found that that is yielding any the kind of information one needs in terms of granularity, in terms of parsing this stuff up? If everything's kind of dumped into this one little pot, do we know, for example, well, this is dual relationships, that would be unprofessional. Everything pretty much that you're going to get busted for is unprofessional. But I wondered whether or not there is any sense of analysis of these types of things. Because I remember in a previous meeting, I think it was Rick that said that they could specify the percentage of complaints as more of a 60-40 split. Is that correct, Rick? Did I do that right?
I don't remember the specific numbers, but
Yeah,
the CRC,
go ahead.
yeah, the Complaint Review Committee gives us a really nice breakdown every board meeting of what has been. It doesn't necessarily go by which statute or regulation. It rather goes by which profession, right? And what was done with it. So that's the level of analysis that the board gets reported to by the CRC every meeting. I don't know if that answers your question, though.
Well, sort of. I know that, and maybe if I babble a little bit more, I'm going to get to where I'm going here. If there was like a 70 or 40, I'm sorry, 70-30 or a 60-40 split of things that were found to be true or relevant that you guys went ahead and dealt with, and another 40% that once you looked at it, you realized that there was nothing there and they were actually dispensed with through administrative action. So I didn't know if that was still the case, because we had talked about at one point the number of complaints and how they seem to have risen in recent years. And we were talking about, what has led to that? Is that increased education on the part of the consumer, or do we just have a larger number of bad actors out there? But I didn't know if that was the case. But I'm asking two different things about just kind of how we slice data and how we analyze kind of the things that we're wrestling with. Do we find that there's a certain thing that we are having more of a problem with per group, whether it be psychologist or social worker?
Yeah, I think I can answer part of that. So there is a process by which our investigators use. When they receive complaints, they check to make sure that we have jurisdiction. And so you have work that's being done by the investigators on any complaint that comes in. But there are a certain number where maybe they have a psychiatrist who committed a violation or a possible violation, and they provide it to the BSRB. Well, psychiatrists are regulated by the Board of Healing Arts. So we would say we did work on it, but we had to pass it to another agency for them to really follow up to determine what could be done with it. So in that situation, it would be a complaint that was investigated that didn't have potentially a violation. You also have other ones where someone makes a complaint where even if everything was true, it still wouldn't be a violation of the statute. Someone was just unhappy about something, but it may not relate at all to professional conduct or unprofessional conduct. They just were very unhappy about something, but even if everything was true in that case, it still wouldn't match the requirements and statutes to be a professional under the BSRB. So those cases also too would get a preliminary investigation and then would be dismissed. But the majority of them at least would go to the complaint review committee for them to weigh all the different things the investigators had collected to see, is there evidence here that a violation has occurred? And then if there was information that a violation occurred, then they would try to determine the right amount of discipline. And I can say that during the pandemic, everything was unusual in a number of different ways, including with complaints. So the number of complaints dropped during the pandemic, and we're not exactly sure why. But since, and not to say that we're out of the pandemic, but basically during the last fiscal year 2021, the complaints were a lot lower than what they normally would be. And as of fiscal year 2022, which began on July 1st, the complaints and the rate has gone back to what it was before last fiscal year. And in terms of the most common complaints that we've been receiving, some of them do have to do with things like boundary issues, sometimes of a sexual nature, sometimes of just a different type of nature, but still related to boundaries and possible dual relationships. Some of it is individuals who may be practicing with an expired license because they didn't renew on time, or maybe they were practicing without a license, that kind of thing. And we also do get a number of individuals who have renewed but didn't meet all of their continuing education requirements. And so there are some technical issues on some of those things. And in terms of the violations, it generally holds pretty close. I think there is maybe a category that would be a little bit different in terms of the complaints versus violations, but most of them do have to do with those topics for the majority of them.
And then there's occasionally things that are related to supervision.
Supervision, and I guess confidentiality would be another one. Sometimes there has been exposure of certain information to a third party, different things like that.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm just happy that we're not sleeping with our clients as much. So, from the sounds of it.
Well, yeah. So that's the big item under discussion of committee work for the upcoming year. So I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. I think one of the things we may want to look at, and David, I should have talked to you about this before. I'm just going to blurt it out here. With the changes in both the standards of accreditation for accredited doctoral programs nationwide, and in addition with the creation of a new accreditation system, the PC-SAS system, I know some of you are familiar with. We may need to take a look at our education requirements statute. What is that? 102-1- is that 13? There's a number of places where our statute specifically requires a number of hours of coursework in different areas. And that's the way the old guidelines and principles of the accreditation body used to work, right? For example, in the old accreditation system, every accredited program had 3 hours of ethics, period. You could not be a accredited clinical program without 3 hours of ethics. Under the new standards of accreditation, you don't necessarily have to have 3 hours of ethics. You have to have covered ethics in your program. So if my program, now we still do 3 hours of ethics, but you can be an accredited program if you can demonstrate to the accrediting body that you have covered the content even without a class. So for example, a program might say, we cover ethics and we distribute that across these classes. So in my in practicum, we're going to cover it. In therapeutic treatments, we're going to cover it. In assessment, we're going to cover it. In history, we're going to cover it, right? And it's up to the program to define that. Well, that's all fine and good because it's an accredited program. And when the board looks at someone's license, they're coming from an accredited program and everything's fine. However, there's a mismatch between what we have in our regulations that says 3 hours of ethics, 3 hours of biological foundations, 3 hours of social, 3 hours of developmental, 3 hours, right? None of those conform to APA accreditation anymore. And there's a new accreditation system, the PCSAS, the accreditation system that the Academy of Clinical Sciences is using. It's now gaining in popularity. There's lots and lots of accredited programs in PCSAS, and it's as good of an accreditation as APA. And so that may be something we want to look at. It's going to be a heavy lift. I can just tell you it's going to be awful because it was so easy to have 3 hours of ethics, 3 hours of, right? And then with this other way, I'm not entirely sure how we're going to deal with it. But after we do with unprofessional conduct and we're really good at going through regs, that may be something to think about over the summer or summer and fall. So.
So this year is the first year that programs might switch to that sort of implementation?
No, actually, the standards of accreditation changed in 2017. And so all programs have had to do things in a competency-based format rather than a class-based format.
Okay, so we probably are already seeing these students?
Oh, yeah, you're definitely seeing those students.
Okay.
Yeah, there's no question that you're seeing those students.
Okay.
Because, yeah, and I could, you know, I know, for example, that there's a good doctoral program. It's not mine. There's another good doctoral program that, for example, doesn't require 3 hours of ethics, but they cover ethics in a way that's consistent with accreditation standards. And, you know, if someone went through our standards and, you know, and then kind of put that up against, or they're through our regulations and then put that up against the standards of accreditation, it would just be very different. And maybe it's not a problem, and that's for us to look at, but it may be that we need to do an overhaul at some point, because APA is never going to go back to the 3 hour way of doing things. So.
Oh, okay.
Maybe there's some other things that we want to try to tackle first, but that at some point, some version of this committee is going to have to deal with that, unfortunately. Dave, were there other specific things that you were thinking of in terms of committee work that we're going to need to think about?
You know, I think the telehealth topic is not a bad thing to be thinking about. I think the next step will probably be something we'll need to get from the board to see how the board would like to be handled between the professions.
Yeah.
But because you brought up some really good points that you and other members of the advisory committee about how there are differences, especially in terms of assessments and testing. You know, that may be a little different between professions. But I think probably the next step I would think would be the board would provide us some guidance on how to tackle that telehealth topic. And then it might involve the advisory committees looking at that as well over the course of this year too.
Yeah, it's possible that I'm not thinking we'll fix it, but we could take a little nibble at the telehealth thing, even as we're looking at the unprofessional conduct, because there are specific items in the unprofessional conduct regulation that address assessment. J, improperly using assessment procedures, which shall include the following acts. And there's 7 that follow under J. And so, in broad strokes, someone who improperly used, Abby, if I tried to get one of my kids to do block design over Zoom, I think you could reasonably say that I have improperly used assessment techniques, right? And so you could probably address that even with our existing regulations. It's not, it's not on the nose, but that unprofessional conduct regulation can address that, right? If some parent, had filed a complaint with the CRC because a psychologist gave, the block design on the WISC over Zoom, or I hadn't ever really thought about the Rorschach over Zoom. That's something to think
You
about.
need to be able to manipulate it. So we thought anything that had a manipulative, we were not.
Right.
Just avoid it.
Yeah. So anyway, it's possible that, item J or line J in that one would allow us maybe even to make some recommendations to the board, to think about in terms of just some general ways of thinking about it. Okay.
Rick, there is one other item, and this is maybe more of a filter to be thinking about as members look at these unprofessional conduct regulations, and that is the area of social media. Some of the other advisory committees have talked about that and how the rules of unprofessional conduct might apply to things like social media. And so just maybe either use that as a filter when looking at these unprofessional conduct, or be thinking about that, in general, because I think between telehealth and social media, those are 2 of the big topics now at a lot of those association meetings. And I think that is relevant to how a lot of people are communicating currently. So it's a little different than maybe things over email or things said in person, but it is still communication.
David, how does one use social media, in our profession? Because I always thought that was way too close to advertisement. And I thought that was a lot of, you needed to stay away from that. I don't personally like to use even text messaging for that matter, because I think that it can be just a little bit sketchy. But how is social media being used by, let's keep it with psychologists now?
Yeah, I don't know if it counts, but I have a ton of kids bring me videos of TikTok videos of people who are saying they're licensed psychologists talking about particular types of issues or concerns, and they'll bring them to me and say, is this real? Is this the way that it works? It's all just like free.
It sounds like advertisement is what it does.
There's a lot of ways this could go really bad, really fast, right? So I'm Facebook friends with my clients.
No.
Well, but it's nowhere in the regulation, right? And I think that's what Dave's getting at. So what about Facebook friends, right? So what if, how do I present my Facebook?
Well, let me ask you, Rick, just for grins here.
Just for grins?
Just for grins. Because
if we were Facebook friends, you would know this, but go ahead and ask.
Okay, there's typically another modifier that I would add before grins, but we are in an open meeting, so let's keep it clean. I wouldn't do that, and I have actually discouraged my patients from even contacting me through Facebook. I wouldn't even accept or acknowledge them there. I'll bring it into a session that I may have noticed that they tried to contact me, because I felt like that was more of the dual relationship thing, and I just, whether just be safe, let's just avoid the whole thing. We're not going to have any type of Facebook contact whatsoever, but I see your point nonetheless. I do see your point.
Yeah, well, this is.
Or how about like a supervisee joining LinkedIn and connecting you through LinkedIn. So that will also be a slippery slope, right?
Yeah, it would.
Or,
I think another example, I've seen Facebook groups that are like therapists or private practice, Facebook groups, and there's always people getting called out for asking questions, pretty much consultation questions about, the work that they're doing with their clients and divulging too much information. And some of those clients are actually in those groups.
I think the social media topic is definitely relevant in a lot of ways. And there are certain things that some people would consider social media and other people would consider other things social media. So it's a very big conversation, but it's definitely a relevant topic to the way that people are putting out information today. So maybe too big of a conversation for us to talk about in great detail right now, but I did want to mention it before we finish the meeting today, just so people would be thinking about it, especially when you're looking at these unprofessional conduct regulations.
Yeah.
There are certain associations that have put out guidance on social media specifically, but I don't know that we've actually adjusted our rules with social media perhaps in mind. And if it was before, like I said, my time with the board. So I want to make sure that you were thinking about that as you were looking through these rules.
Yeah. And that really could, that one filter could touch on so many of them, right? Invasions of privacy, right? And all the things that I could do looking up my clients on various platforms, so there's a lot of ways to look at this. That'll be a fun conversation or series of conversations. Okay. It looks like we need to see if April the 12th, Tuesday, April 12th is an acceptable time for us to meet next.
I know I'm just a single person, but I will be out of town, just FYI.
Abby's going to be out of town. Okay.
I can provide to you my feedback though on the regulation ahead of time.
We can either do this now or we can do can David do a doodle poll and we could determine whether, because, we can absolutely look 1 week before or 1 week after. All 3 of those weeks are equally good for me. And so if that would be acceptable, David, if instead of nailing down a specific Tuesday night, if maybe we can do a doodle poll and we'll pick the one that works the best for the most people. Do you use doodle poll or do you use something similar?
We usually use doodle poll for those, so I can set one up and then send it out. And then whenever we get the most members that can attend, we can go ahead and use that date.
That sounds great. And if you're available all 3, make sure you click all 3 so we can have the most degrees of freedom. You don't like statistical terms when we're talking about meetings, Rodney? You gave me a look.
Wait, I just want to make sure that I can articulate what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I was thinking I didn't sign up for that.
Yeah, you're such a geek. I mean, you are such a geek. But go ahead, I like it. You're my kind of geek. I know what you're talking about.
That's why we're not Facebook friends, is because you say me Facebook. Okay. Well, on my agenda, the next thing is adjournment. And in order for that to happen, we need someone to have a motion to adjourn, or else we have to stay on here all night.
I can move to adjourn.
Okay.
I
Okay. It looks like Carol beat you to it, Rodney. Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Hi.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, David, for organizing everything. Appreciate your work. I know there's a bunch of professions you have to deal with, and we're a motley crew. So
Happy to help.
Okay. Everyone have a good evening and take good care.
Good night.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.